as soon as you are using words with your children on the changing table, you can call their body parts their right body parts. When they're potty training, you're talking about privacy, or you're talking about body parts. You can talk about seeds and eggs when you're doing snack time. And instead of going to the garbage disposal with that core of apples, you open it up. Deep inside of every living thing is part of what it takes to make the next living thing just like it. You're just bringing up peripheral stories. How did that baby get out of there? Well, this is an exciting story. Buckle up. This is really fun, and be ready to tell them. So it's important that they know that lack of information doesn't mean an increase in innocence. Don't equate innocence with ignorance. Mm-hmm. And so that's what we want parents to know, is that actually ignorance is vulnerability. Then they're vulnerable to hearing those messages and assuming that's the right thing to hear.
Welcome to Peds Doc Talk TV and this episode of the Peds Doc Talk podcast, where you can catch my amazing conversations with guests on the show here on my YouTube channel, or if you prefer audio only, wherever you access podcasts. I'm Dr. Mona Amin, a board-certified pediatrician, lactation consultant, and mom of two, and I'm here to uplift, support, and guide you so you can raise those incredible kids. Let's get to today's amazing conversation.
I don't know about you, but conversations surrounding sex were not had in my home growing up. And as a pediatrician, I believe this is a huge disservice to our children, as one day this will happen and they need to learn about this, ideally from someone they trust, a caregiver. Today's guests are Mary, Flo, and Megan, who are educators that are passionate about changing the way parents talk to their kids about sex by teaching practical strategies to equip and empower parents. And we're talking about having conversations about sex with our children. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having us, Dr. Mona.
We're really excited to be here.
Yeah.
And I know you all sort of go around the country and in your local area talking about this. So tell us more about yourselves and why this work is so important for you.
Well, this work has been important to me for a long time. When I was a young mother and I had a 4-year-old and a 1-year-old, I started getting questions. And like you, I grew up in a family where the word sex was never said. There was never any explanation of anything. And I had loving, wonderful parents, but that just wasn't part of what they were going to explain to me. So I went on a journey to discover, could there be a better way than waiting for the 13-year-old conversation, waiting for that awkward conversation at that awkward age, the talk. Could I go ahead and answer their question when they're asking, Mommy, how is that baby getting out of there? Could I start and just have some simple age-appropriate conversations? So I did a lot of research and talked to a lot of counselors and pediatricians and got the go-ahead that would be okay, that this would not be, destructive to your child or whatever. And so that was the beginning of this journey. And what we saw in our own family, and also as I shared this with other people in schools and churches, that this was getting traction. Like, people were so surprised that they could do this before the hormones kicked in, before it was an awkward conversation. They could just slip in conversations about seeds and eggs and body parts and safety, and not all at one sitting, but drip, drip, drip into their childhood.
And then I was teaching middle school when I first heard Mary Flo. So after my undergrad, I was a middle school teacher, and I was very overwhelmed, I guess, by the sexualization of their culture. And these are preteens. Mm-hmm. So I thought, wow, they sure are talking about a lot, or, it was very overwhelming. And so one day I heard that she was coming to the parent ed, parents talking to your kids about sex. I thought, I've got to go hear this. And funny story is, I actually knew the Ridley family growing up, but I had no idea that Mrs. Ridley did this. And so I was equally intrigued. So I went, I did not have kids of my own yet. And so I went to hear this, and kind of through the lens of my preteen students who I adored. And I left that night after she spoke thinking, wow, every parent has to hear this. It was amazing. And I thought this education could totally transform families, could transform middle school, could transform marriages. We just aren't talking about sex in healthy ways. And her message is such an incredible tool and empowering for parents.
Well,
so that was the beginning of me.
I love this origin story. I love this. I love that you obviously were at one of her sessions and then you decided to join on and work with her and do this even more to get to spread the word, correct?
Yeah. So there was many years in between.
So great.
Awesome.
So I taught middle school and then went on to have two of my own kids. And then we got paired up and decided, okay, let's do this. And then, so yeah, there is a longer story, but yes, that is exactly what happened. And then, so now I have 3 kids of my own and I am in the middle of all this and putting my money where my mouth is every day, talking to my own kids about this stuff, being like, okay, I just told people on Instagram to say this and now I have to do it myself. Yeah. So we're in, a minute.
Well, I love this because,
and your kids are really,
I love this because when, we talk about this conversation, right? The talk, like you mentioned, people do either wait for it to happen much later, in the teens, or in my situation, it really never gets talked about at all. So a lot of the situation, what I'm seeing in my patient population where their families are not having this conversation, they're getting this from somewhere. So where are they getting this information from? Movies, media, TikTok, which is not always the right place to get it if you're not getting it from the right resources, right? Educated people talking about it like you are. So it's really a huge disservice to the child because they're getting it from places that are probably not the best resource. And so when you all do your workshops, because I know you do a lot of in-person events, which I think is phenomenal, and then you also, have some resources that people can get from online. What is the feedback, and also what are the reservations parents have about these conversations? Are they nervous that their child may not understand what this means? Do they not know the right words to say? What do you think are the barriers for parents to have these conversations with their children?
Well, there are lots of barriers for sure. Like they're intimidated to take on this topic. They're afraid of the questions they might get. But we give them sample conversations. I think that is one thing that the feedback we get was, thank you. They may not say it exactly the way we give this, sample, what do we call it? Like
talking
just
tips.
Just the talking tips. And here's how this would sound. So how did that baby get in there? This is how you might say it. So they haven't heard it because either their parents didn't say it. But where will those children go when they need more information? Mm-hmm. Will they go back to TikTok? Will they find another movie? They need to have a connection with their parents on this topic. They need to see their parents as the loving authority. And that's really why starting so young is the key, because you're telling them a lot of other things at that age. And this just slides right in.
And I think to your question, like, how do parents feel? I mean, we feel this in live events because it's so face to face. And so obviously with the online course, we're not watching people watch us, but in the live events, I mean, you can just sense the energy in the room. People are flooding in and kind of taking their seats and, no nervous. One's on the front row and everyone's nervous and no one wants to make contact, and then anyway, we get going and this actually was a lot more fun than it sounds, believe it or not. And by the end of this hour-ish program we share, I mean, you can just feel the energy. Everyone's feeling light and they're almost, I mean, I hate to say this, but they're almost excited.
They're high-fiving.
To go home and talk to their kids about sex. And it's like, it's the most rewarding part of our job is to see the transformation in an hour's time of like complete dread. I think they're afraid they're going to mess up. They're afraid they don't know how to have these conversations. They're afraid of putting ideas in their kids' heads. They're afraid of taking away innocence. They're afraid of, there's so many different fears and discomforts. This topic brings up a lot of people's baggage and issues. So there's so much going on here. But for our specific role in this field, it's really exciting to watch parents leave feeling empowered. Because, I mean, to your point too, with your job, it's like, you aren't going home with these people.
Yeah.
The parents have to do the work. And so for us to be able to instill that confidence in parents with words and phrases and strategies and just information, I think it's so empowering for the parents and exciting for us to be like, okay, now go home. You can do this. You got this. So it's exciting.
Yeah, that empowerment piece, like you mentioned, like they go from, again, the nerves that brought them into that room to what is there to be nervous about now? I got this. I can handle it. Yeah. And I love what you mentioned about the worry that we're taking away a child's innocence, and also that we're putting ideas into their head, because I also agree that we're not doing that. And I use the example also of when we talk to children about alcohol and drug use. right? Similar concept that parents are like, well, no, if I talk to them about it, they're more likely to do it. And I'm like, actually, no, if we don't talk to them, they're more likely to do things in an unsafe manner or not understand what they're doing. And so abstinence education is not what we need to do here. We need to be forthcoming. And, you mentioned going downstream and really starting early. So how young can we start these conversations?
Are you ready?
I'm ready. I love it.
We encourage parents to come who have preschool to preteen. And as soon as you are using words with your children on the changing table, you can call their body parts their right body parts. When they're potty training, you're talking about privacy, or you're talking about body parts. You can talk about seeds and eggs when you're doing snack time. And instead of going to the garbage disposal with that core of apples, you open it up. Deep inside of every living thing is part of what it takes to make the next living thing just like it. You're just bringing up peripheral stories. How did that baby get out of there?
Yeah.
Well, this is an exciting story. Buckle up. This is really fun, and be ready to tell them. So it's important that they know that lack of information doesn't mean an increase in innocence. Don't equate innocence with ignorance. And so that's what we want parents to know, is that actually ignorance is vulnerability. Then they're vulnerable to hearing those messages and assuming that's the right thing to hear.
And I think to Mary Flo's point, vocabulary is a conversation. It's, we're not saying, oh yeah, tell your kids about sex when they're 2. That is not what we're saying. But what we're trying to do overall at Birds and Bees is get rid of this idea of the talk, quotation marks, and replace it with multiple age appropriate conversations. So at age 2 or 3, what does that look like? Oh, that's your penis. That's a private part. Remember, nobody else can touch your private parts. These are little conversations we're having, and that they build. And we want to be frequent and frank with our tone of voice. And we want to be medical and matter of fact. We're talking about bodies and body parts, body boundaries. And we're not making this. We love pediatricians for a billion reasons, personally and professionally. Yes. But we tell parents to use your pediatrician voice. In the pediatric world, you guys have a phrase you use a lot at well visits, saying, okay, well, Dr. So-and-so is going to be looking at your vagina. I can only do this because your mommy's in the room, some kind of ideation of that phrase. But that is so helpful for parents to hear, because as adults, we know that stems from a very heavy topic of abuse prevention. That's very heavy. But the tone of voice that the pediatrician uses in that room is not. We can share things at an age appropriate level in a very black and white way. And it doesn't only have to happen in the doctor's office. We can do that in our homes. If the neighbors are over playing and, they're playing doctor with their clothes off. Oh, sweetheart, remember, we don't play with our clothes off with our friends. Okay, our private parts are private. Put your clothes back on. Let's leave the door open while we play. Lots of little conversations that just little by little we're building. And what Mary Flo said about seeds, this concept of seeds creating new life and eggs creating new life. That's foundational for all reproduction. And so having these little conversations when your kids are little and asking questions and believing you, that kind of lay this foundation for so many conversations.
Oh, I love that you take it so early. And I'm not shocked. You said, get ready. I was ready, but I expected it to be preschool and above, because their curiosity is through the roof at that age. I have a 4-year-old at the time of this recording, and he's asking so many questions about everything. He sees a lizard that we live in Florida. He sees a lizard that's at our house, and we have conversations about death. We have conversations about life. It's so important. I love that you're talking about seeds and creating new life. How do you approach that big conversation around where do babies come from? A lot of that stuff that happens with the young child who has their new sibling approaching maybe in mommy's belly. How do you approach that conversation?
Well, first of all, we really encourage parents to take that baby out of the belly and really be specific that the baby is growing in the uterus, because we laugh at this, but we're taking the babies out of the digestive system and into the reproduction system. Yeah. So it's kind of being medical and matter of fact about it. Usually they ask about birth before they ask about conception. They're curious about how that baby gets out before the baby gets in. So you've already got some of the anatomy known to the child. But when they do ask, you just keep it to the basic biology And then the first step of the birds and bees strategy is for you to have a message to your children. Like in one sentence, what is the main thing you want your children to know about sex if they're growing up in your family? So you take vocabulary from that, and you take vocabulary from the very basic biology, and you give just a simple kind of mechanical explanation of how the seed, the sperm, is deep inside of the daddy. The egg is deep inside of the mommy. When the mommy and the daddy meet and join together in a special way, the seed travels through the penis to the seed, and that's how the baby gets started. But you can also add value to that if you want to add your faith component, if you want to talk about healthy things regarding that, whatever your other priorities are, you can add vocabulary.
And I think it's important to remember to these phrases is that's not the first time or only time. That's not the only time you're going to talk to your kids about this. So whether it sounds like, oh, babies come from a seed from the dad and an egg from the mom, that could be a basic place to start. You're not having to dive into penises and vaginas until years later, but what you're doing is laying a foundation, because I think there's also freedom to know that's my first conversation, but that's not my last. And so we don't feel this panic of like, well, my 4-year-old wants to know where that baby brother came from. I'm just going to be honest with them and tell them everything. It's like, okay, you don't have to do that. But you can be honest. And that's where we love the Seeds and Eggs Foundation, because it does build such an age appropriate understanding of like, okay, it takes 2 parts to make this baby, and again, the story surrounding this characters of Seeds and Eggs is going to change for every family. Every family is going to have a different approach. Some families might later on include words like IVF or surrogacy. There's going to be words to parts of the stories, which is a cool spin for every family. Is going to be different, which is great. And so the basics of Seeds and Eggs kind of is a great place to start. And then as your child matures, you can add the different characters that make your family.
And how that seed and egg got together.
Yeah.
Like you don't have to drop the heavy book called Sex on their head.
Yeah.
Right at the beginning. Let me just introduce you to some characters. And one is a seed and an egg. And you're just starting the story with them.
I love that you also include, obviously, the faith-based messaging, right? Really respective of that. I think that's a lot of the barriers that I see a lot of the times. I grew up in a culture where it just wasn't talked about from my parents' generations of marriage, like sex before marriage, all of that stuff, that is very personal to a family. Like, what are the values that you are trying to teach? So I love that you bring in that component. And also, I really, really love the anatomical naming, right? The uterus, the penis, the vagina, the vulva, all of that. In your opinion, I know, you talk about the seed and the egg conversations early. Why is it so important to you that we are also talking about anatomical names for an autonomy aspect when we talk about sex? Like, why, for parents that may not understand the importance of that, you mentioned and alluded to consent, and like, hey, I'm changing your table. No one else can look at your vagina or penis, only if mommy's here. Why is that so important as it relates to sex? And if some listeners might not understand that connection.
So obviously those parts are important to having sex. And that might be a whole background story if you don't know that yet, but assuming you do. So obviously we're going to use those vocabulary words when we're explaining conception. So what we don't want to do, to kind of back it up to this idea of, we don't want to have one big bombshell conversation. So in light of that, what we don't want to do is introduce the terms penis and vagina for the first time when we're then explaining intercourse. That's a lot of information at once. And we don't want them to have any sort of shame around these parts. And so what we want you to do is back that up and kind of introduce these words, little by little over the years. Now, so that's one reason. The main reason is really for their safety. And as a pediatrician, obviously you know this, but the number one thing that we as parents can do to protect our kids from sexual abuse is to speak very openly and very matter-of-factly about these body parts. Because what happens is, we use names for everything, but then we kind of whisper the word private.
Yes, or whisper.
Or we kind of have and that kind of enhances the shame around these parts. And in a way, we're intending to or not, kind of sends this message to our kids, like, those are bad parts, or those are secret parts, or we don't talk about those parts. And so God forbid anything happened to those parts, they don't feel comfortable or don't even have the vocabulary to use it, to talk to you about that. And so we don't want to enhance the shame. And then we also have a lot of tendencies to use kind of silly, willy, wingy, wangy words for those parts. And that enhances the silliness that kids, as you know, as a parent, and we all know, as kids are silly about their body parts. That is just a fact, especially their private parts. That's just the way they are. And that's okay. But we as the adults don't want to enhance the silliness either. And so we want to be very clear with body parts and body boundaries. I think so often with body parts and good touch versus bad touch abuse situations, there's so much gray and there's kind of silence. Yeah. And so kids feel, well, I didn't like that, or I don't know what just happened, but they don't have any concept of a black and white line was crossed, or, oh, I know if this happens, I do this. And so what we're really trying to do is just encourage in everyone's little individual homes, this is something we talk about. I have 2 boys and a girl. So my 2 boys, I feel like they provide ample conversations in my home about this. If they're in the bathtub together being silly, boys, cut it out. You don't touch his penis. We never touch somebody else's private parts. Okay, and if someone touches the private parts, you come and tell mom. Okay, who's going to get out of the bathtub first? I mean, we are just having these conversations over and over again. And I think the importance of that is to really just establish this tone in your home of, this is something we talk about, and this is not a secret thing. I don't want to be embarrassed to say something to my mom, or I can feel comfortable because my dad uses this language. Mm-hmm. What you're really trying to do is protect your kids ultimately. I love it. Like, this is not anything this is not embarrassing. This is not something that we shy away from in our home
or keep secrets about.
Yeah, we don't keep secrets. So really, the anatomically correct terms is for their safety, number one, first and foremost. And secondly, because you're going to need those words as these conversations build. And you don't want to be explaining intercourse the first time your child hears you say the word penis, because that's too much.
Yeah, it's a lot of information. And I love that you mentioned the word shame around this conversation. And also, for me, I find it so important and valuable to talk about anatomical parts early, penis, vagina, all of that, because also what is appropriate touch, because even if they end up in a consensual sexual relationship later in life and it doesn't feel right or something is not right, I want them to know from an early age that I can say no. Like, I have the strength here and confidence to say no, like, this isn't right. We talk about, even if it's in a marriage or even if it's in a dating relationship, whatever it is, I want children to have that strength and confidence to know what does or doesn't feel right to me. Is this something that I want to do when we talk about body autonomy? So I love that we're giving the children slow confidence in that and planting that seed, like you mentioned, and also removing the shame around our body parts. And it's so interesting to me because we tend to create funny, silly words for like the penis and the vagina, but yet we don't create those words for ears or nose, right? Like, it's always the private parts. Elbow. Yeah. You're not calling your ear your eerie weary, right? But you'll call your penis your tinkle winkle, right? Like, it's so interesting to me because, again, we're trying to create levity around an anatomical part that is so, like you said, it's part of our bodies. And I love this. We practice the same way. And so I really appreciate when, you all are spreading the good word out there from the beginning to really, again, empower parents to say, this is part of our life in the bathtub. Like you said, you're talking about it. Hey, yep, we do not allow other people to see it. In the bathtub, it's perfectly fine. And that is how they learn about, yeah, you can celebrate your body, all of your body. And I think that's such a valuable thing that you're doing for families.
I want to bring up the phrase you kind of mentioned, because Mary Flo has some great examples of this. But what we say a lot at Birds and Bees is no means no and stop means stop. We're talking about tickling and.
Well, yes. When my children were young, my husband was very helpful in trying to get them to be tired to go to bed. So he would throw them on the bed. They'd try to get off. He'd throw them back on. This is this great game. But so one night he was doing that. I was sitting on the floor folding clothes, and he would tickle them when they got on the bed. He would kind of shake the head and tickle them. And one of the children said, "Daddy, stop." And he said, "Oh, you really love this." And I was like, bing. What did you just teach her? That she said no. And it's true. She would 2 seconds later say, "Tickle me again." Like, he knew that, but he wasn't teaching her that if she says stop, people that love you will stop. people that respect you will stop. And so he was so ashamed.
And he did not mean he's a wonderful dad.
No, but it was like, you're
Yes.
right. I didn't think of it. So just changing that little conversation to say, sweetheart, you said stop. So we're stopping until you say go. But you are in charge of that. I take no very seriously. And so we, would even physically step away and they could know the power of their voice in that. And I've seen it. I have 9 grandchildren, and I've seen it generationally, so that now I see my grandchildren, actually they're talking to siblings, to each other. I said stop.
Yeah.
Stop me,
So
stop.
it's been passed
I love
down.
that.
It's true. And
Yeah.
to your point, it's like we're just building this muscle
Yeah.
in our young boys and young girls of like, their voice should have power, and they should be able to feel confident using their voice, whether they're 4 or whether they're 14 or 24, And so I think that, like everything, these things build, very few things in life require conversation, and that's it. But for some reason, we have decided that sex and all things sexual should have one conversation at the worst time, and then we never speak of it again. And we just think of birds and bees, there's a better way.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Funny too. One time, this same daughter that was saying that was able to introduce me at her church when I was talking there, and she said something that it was so dear to me, because I'd never heard her say this before. But she said, "Everything you're going to hear my mom say tonight, I know, but I don't know when I learned it." And most people would say they know exactly when they learned about sex. But if you grow up in a family where these are just part of the conversations and what they're learning about, they can't even point to a day that this was not known to them on some level, So it's not that many conversations. Like we're probably making it sound like you talk about this every day, but that's not the case. It's just that you talk about it appropriately and age appropriately, and fake it till you make it. If you don't feel comfortable, look like you feel comfortable.
Yeah. I love the no means no and stop means stop. And I love the tickling example that you all gave, because that is a prime example of what I was saying earlier about something that is pleasurable, right? Like tickling is nice. It feels good until it doesn't. And using that with sex, and I'm going to be very open about this, sex can feel good until it doesn't. And if someone says stop, we should respect that. And that is, people, parents sometimes hear that and they're like, come on, tickling is not the same as sex. Obviously it's not, but it's about the stop that you said. If it doesn't feel good anymore, and you listen to them, and like you said, they may start tickling again or want that. Amazing. We do the same thing. Same funny story that my husband initially was like, it's okay, we're just roughhousing and playing. I'm like, no, but when he says no, stop. And then again, stop, they start over again when they say yes. And then now he says to our family members, all of that, like the other thing that I always add is the guilt and shame, right? Like about hugs and like, hey, oh, you don't want to give me a hug. Oh, that made me feel so bad. Oh, you don't want me to tickle you. Oh, like making them feel guilty for not wanting that physical attention. That is another layer of autonomy. But I think this is so important, that we're starting that early. And then my other question for you all is, we talk about how with your program, you really are starting this very young. Is there a certain age, though, that you're really recommending more of that talk, or not, because you're starting it from early in terms of a developmentally appropriate age of like, okay, now we're going to talk about actual sex, what it looks like, all of that. Is that kind of built in at a certain age in your guys' curriculum?
So we have a thing about age that we talk about a lot. And the long and short of it is that we don't like to give an age.
Yes.
If we said, okay, the perfect age is age 11, 4 months, 2 days. All these parents listening to this pediatrician podcast would get their phones out, mark that date, set the alarm, and just refresh it. But it doesn't work like that, because, you have 2 kids. I'm sure your youngest is probably doing things as a baby that your oldest never did. And that's the day the number 2 comes home from the hospital. They probably watch a little bit of TV, where the firstborn is like, well, we don't do screens, and that just goes on with their whole life, from like the food they eat, the time they go to bed, the number of baths they have each week, the shows they watch, the music they listen to. All these things just change because our families are essentially the age of our oldest child, and everybody else keeps up. And so my 6-year-old, my baby, is so different as a child, and the world that he lives in is so different than when my oldest was 6 and what our family looked like then and what we did then. And so I look at these two, my bookends, and I'm kind of like, whoa, y'all are so different. And so the conversations I'm having with him are going to be vastly different at different ages than like my oldest. So all that being said is we don't have a hard, fast age. But I think sometimes if you're listening as a parent and you're thinking like you're behind, or maybe you're kind of too late, like, oh, well, shoot, we're going to middle school next year, or, we're 12 and I haven't said anything. So if you're feeling kind of panicked like that, obviously we believe that sooner is better than later. But later is better than never.
Yes.
And so we just encourage you, don't, pause this podcast and go pick up your kid from school and tell them everything. Don't do that. Kind of give yourself space and say, okay, it might be more intentional. It might be more forward conversations than the seeds in the apple. Mm-hmm. Maybe with an older child, like, I feel like he needs to understand what sex is and know the term sex before we go to junior high. And that's going to be in the fall. Okay. So over the next 6 months, I'm going to kind of walk through some of these steps with a bit more intention and start using these body part words, or maybe just own up and say, you know what, honey, I haven't talked to you about some of these topics as much as I should have. And so on Tuesday nights, we're going to walk around the block and I'm going to kind of tell you a few things. You don't have to look at me. We can walk side by side. But it's really important that you hear from me before you go off to middle school or whatever. So I would say there's not necessarily a hard, fast age, but your child and their environment better than anybody else. So if you feel like, before summer camp, I want them to know this word, or before, like we said, junior high, so then be mindful, like, how can I back that up so we don't have to have one big talk? And then a phrase we really like to use with kids, if you feel behind or with kids who aren't asking questions, is, have you ever wondered?
Yeah.
And that's a great way to some of these conversations. And so for an older child, or a preteen, it might be most forward to saying, have you ever wondered what the word sex means? Mm-hmm. And you can dive into that. But again, the hope is that we build these conversations over time. And so it's not this one big bombshell.
Boom.
Because even if you have a bombshell conversation, you should be following it up afterwards.
Absolutely.
Because the reality is, even like my oldest is 11, almost 11, and she knows the basics of everything. But I remember before, like, we had one conversation I'll never forget, like in my brain, like I know where we were, I was driving, the question that was asked, the words that I said, I'm sweating, all the things, like, this is big for me personally and professionally. Yeah. This is a big moment. Like, and then, like, I forgot what it was, like 6 to 8 months later, she kind of asked the same question again. And I was like, well, don't you remember that conversation we had, that big day?
That day.
And she was, I remember. And so I think that's another, like, kind of perk of having these conversations when our kids are young, is you get practice, and your kids aren't like that to you. They're going to say, oh yeah, my mom talked to me about that. Can you say that again? Or I don't really remember. It's not as weighty.
And you don't have to do it perfectly.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. You've had the pressure to talk. I've got to do this perfectly. And I think that's a barrier for parents also. They don't feel equipped to do it perfectly. You are off the hook because you can do it really poorly for a 7-year-old. And 2 days later, you can tell
Amazing.
them again.
Yeah.
We like the phrase also, circle back. Like, as a parent, if you leave that conversation and think, I left off some of the most important stuff, I just didn't do it well, or that was a very incomplete answer, or I didn't like my tone, or I seemed scared. You can say, you know what, you asked me a great question the other day and I've been thinking about it and I'd like to try another answer. They're not going to say, sorry, you had your chance.
Exactly.
They'll happy to hear it again. But a lot of times people will say, well, they've never asked. So I really want to encourage that phrase. Children aren't in charge of this topic. Like, the parents have to be. And so if you think, my child doesn't know anything about periods, when it will be a good time for me to bring it up? Look for an opportunity to talk about periods. Or my child's never asked exactly how did that baby get in there. So maybe you take a meal to a friend who's had a baby and you take that child with you on the way home. You say, wow, can you believe that baby's here 9 months inside the mommy? Have you ever wondered how that baby got in there? Or out? What have you not asked that I can say, that I can take the lead on? And giving them permission. Sometimes they really are curious. They just haven't verbalized it to you. So We can't just leave it up to them and say, well, you never asked, well, that's not going to work.
That's right. We want to be proactive.
Yeah. And I love your sooner than later and later better than never. That is such a great motto with everything regarding parenting, right? And you said it perfectly that so many times, not even just with conversations around sex, but in so many different things, right? Parents, I feel like in our generation, especially, are so focused on saying the right thing or the right script that they end up not being authentic to their own voice, or they end up feeling like, well, now I just, like you said, I messed it up and it's over. No, your child's in your house. Like, you have many opportunities, like you said, to repair and to revisit. And I also think, I speak a lot about parenting on my show and on my resources. By doing that, you're also showing that you're also evolving and learning with them. And it's such a good thing for a child to see that, you know what? My mom or dad or caregiver said something and learned more and wanted to revisit a conversation. I always have that trusted individual with me to grow with me in this journey, whether it's about sex, whether it's about some other world event that you know nothing about that you're trying to educate yourself on. I think it creates a culture of children who are curious, but also know that they have security with their caregiver. So I love that. And, you all have provided so many pearls. I love chatting with you, love the work that you do, because it's going to make my job easier as a pediatrician, because I cannot tell you when I hit the jackpot, I'm in a triangle seating with me, a teenager, and a parent who they're open about everything. We are talking about sex. We are talking about alcohol use. We are talking about drug use. It's not, I'm doing this behind my mom's back, or, I'm doing this behind my dad's back. No, there is equal conversation about the safety, the risks, protection, all of that is happening. And I feel like it's a dream situation for me as a clinician versus having to do this. Okay, now I got to talk privately. And now this, it's my dream that I feel like every parent should feel comfortable talking to their kids about this issue. And also every child should feel that they're safe talking to their parent about these issues. And I think that work that you're doing is right on. Like, you are helping a huge new generation of parents realize the power in this for our children. So thank you.
Oh, you're so welcome.
That's very encouraging.
I know. Thank you for those kind words.
Yeah, yes. I think when I started following you recently, when I reached out to have you all join the show, and the beauty about social media is that you don't really realize accounts until you do. And then you're like, wow, why wasn't I following them? And I had, I saw that you were attending these workshops in like different places, like in person. And I was like looking at the big room of people attending your events. And I was like, amazing. This is so powerful. And again, I really think that this work needs to be in so many different places, which is why I wanted you on my show. What would be your final message for everyone listening today?
I would just say an encouraging, like, you can do this. So like, your kids need you and you can do this.
And also that you don't really need to have a lot of other affirmation of this. You don't have to have all your friends doing it together. Yeah. You don't have to have the school's permission. You don't have to, you can be this person in their life, and start with really small steps and give yourself some grace. You're going to mess up. Mm-hmm. There's not one parent who does this perfectly. Right. So we're not looking for perfect parenting, but purposeful parenting. And like you said, when you do circle back, you're teaching your children. So if I have a follow-up question, I can go back to you. Yeah. So you're kind of showing them that this is a conversation, not a talk. And that's what we really want parents to know. Also, you're so sweet to talk about our live events, but in a minute, Megan will tell you our really comprehensive resource is something you can just watch in your home. And it's everything you would hear at a live event, because we can only be
Yes.
We can only travel.
Well, tell us more about where people can go to get more information, including all of your resources. Obviously, I know you do live events, but again, the online courses as well. Where can people go to stay connected?
So we do love live events. I mean,
me too. I love them too, which is why I'm like, I watched yours and I'm like, yes, even though I may not be talking about the same stuff, I'm like, I feel excited for you and your group when I get to see your live events, because I love them too. They're energizing, like you said. They're so energizing. But yes, tell us where people can go to stay connected.
So live events are awesome. So if we're not coming to a city near you, our online course is the most comprehensive resource we have, like Mary Flo said. And essentially what we did really after COVID, when live events kind of stopped, we pivoted. We have this online course that is essentially everything we share in a live event You can watch from the comfort of your own home. And it's been
with your friends,
with your husband, with the second
not
grade,
with your children.
Yeah, not with your children.
Yeah.
With second grade moms, have the neighborhood friends over with a glass of wine if that helps you feel better. But our hope is that the online course can meet you where you are and we can come essentially to your home and you can watch it all at once. A lot of people just will sit down and watch it. It takes just like a little over an hour. Some people like to watch it and push play and watch like little sessions at a time. But really our hope is that that has been very accessible to people. We have parents all over the world watching it, which is really exciting because this is kind of a universal problem. But we feel really excited and grateful that we feel like we have a universal solution. And so the online course is out there. We'll send you a code, Mona.
With a workbook. It comes with a discussion guide.
It has a discussion guide, which really complements everything you've heard to kind of help facilitate discussion questions. We'll send you a code so you can get them a discount code. And then if you want lots of talking tips and just day-to-day stuff, you can follow us on Instagram.
Do follow us on Instagram.
Yes, birds and bees, correct? The Instagram handle?
Yeah, I think it's birds_bees.
Yes, and I'm going to,
in the show
notes, I'm going to, birds_bees. I'm going to be attaching that Instagram handle as well as their website and resources to my show notes and as well as a code. Thank you all so much. And again, thank you for taking the time to really spread this information. Like I said, I love what you mentioned. This is a conversation and not a talk because it's an ongoing thing that we're going to have with our children. Thank you so much for joining me. This was incredible.
Thank you, Dr.
I know. Thank you so much for using your platform to invite us. It's a great opportunity. So thank you. Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in. If you love this conversation, make sure to hit that thumbs up sign, share this episode on your social media channels, and subscribe to this channel to stay up to date on all future episodes and our weekly educational videos. Have questions or comments? Make sure to comment below, and I'll see you all next time. Stay well, stay loved, and keep on shining.